Today we're reviewing the Intel i7-12700K. We also bought the KF SKU. That's right, F SKU from Intel. So we bought both of those. $450 is what we paid retail for the K SKU, and then we paid $430 for the KF. If you don't remember, the F means that there's no IGP. And if all of those letters don't mean anything, it boils down to integrated graphics. So we're looking at these CPUs today. We've already reviewed the 12900K, the 12600K. Now we're coming in with the CPU that slots in right between those two in terms of price, and that'll round out the stack from what Intel has released so far with Alder Lake. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now, and we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So from what we've seen so far, the 12700K appears to still be available, at least at the time of filming, which is Sunday night after the launch for this set of processors, be November 7th, 8th, and they came out on the 4th. So that seems to be the one that's in highest supply. The biggest issue right now, it looks like, is going to be DDR5 availability. As a reminder, however, these do work with DDR4, not at the same time. You can't, one, they're not physically compatible. DDR4 and 5, they do not socket into the same socket physically. And two, if you happen to find a board that have both DDR4 and 5 on them, and I haven't personally looked for these, but traditionally there's at least one out there during a switchover period, it's going to be 2 slots that do one tech and then 2 slots that do the other, and you can't combine them. Anyway, you could do DDR4 with this if you have trouble finding 5. But the point is the 12700K and the KF seem to be still available. $450, $430, what you can expect to pay USD if it's being sold by the retailer directly anyway. And the specs for them, so it's got 8 performance cores and 4 efficient cores. We've been calling these P cores and E cores. If you're not familiar with this terminology and you don't know the specifics of it, but you would like to learn, you can watch our architecture piece where Patrick Stone on our team with a computer engineering background wrote up the script to talk about the architectural details. The 12700 series is 20 threads in total for the K and the KF. There will likely be a non-K, non-KF SKU in the future. Intel claims 5 gigahertz for the maximum frequency. It says 4.9 for turbo and 3.6 to 3.8 for the E-core maximum frequency. The biggest difference between the 12700K and the 12900K, other than the E-core count, is the TDP. It's that simple, where they're both a 125 watt base, but the 12700K and the KF have a 190 watt maximum turbo power rating, which is contingent on things like motherboard settings and V-core, and the 12900K runs a 241 watt maximum turbo power. So there are other changes. The 12900K has 4 more E-cores that will show up in applications like Blender, where yes, even though the E-cores are sound far less interesting or far less effective than the performance cores, they're still fully functional cores. They're just a bit slower. So that's the difference between them. The power number is going to surface mostly in things like efficiency, where the 12700, you should see a trend develop where it's more efficient for the work getting done than the 12900K. Typically, the way this works is with any silicon, GPUs or CPUs or memory even, as the effective performance ramps and approaches its maximum limitation in terms of frequency, the efficiency or the performance per watt falls off in a non-linear fashion. You especially see this with GPUs, whereas you approach the high end or you do liquid nitrogen overclocking like we've done, you might end up taking a card that was 300 watts to 1,000 watts, but those last 600 watts, you're not really adding a lot over the first 100 watts of overclocking that you did. So that's the angle to keep in mind, is that the 12700 should show better power efficiency than the 12900. Because it's operating closer to its optimal range instead of being pushed to get that flagship halo effect that the 12900 was going for. Enough of the basics for this one. As always, we'll link the other reviews in the description below. If you want to see our 12600K review, our 12900K review, or additional information, our 12900K review is the one that will have information on the testing platforms. We talk about the coolers used, we talk about the memory used, the motherboard used, and the BIOS settings. All of that is in the 12900K review. We're not going to go over it here again because it's redundant. And then additionally, we talked about our choice of Windows 10 versus Windows 11 in the 12900K review. We have data for both now. We've published a sort of recap of them, and you can check that on the channel if you're interested specifically in that data. But let's get started with the 12700K and the KF. review and results. We'll start this one with power consumption, since it's the primary difference between the 12900K and the 12700K, aside from the E-core difference. In a Blender all-core workload and measured after 5 minutes of execution, meaning that tau has expired on CPUs where it's relevant, the Intel i7-12700K ended up at 158 watts for full and constant load. That's significantly less than the 12900K, which plotted at 244 watts. That's basically an HEDT CPU. Actually, it is an HEDT CPU in power consumption anyway. The 12700K is therefore comparable to the 3900X in power draw, or about 25 watts more than what we tested on the R9 5900X. That 25 watt difference works out to about 19% more power consumption on the 12700K. The 5950X is a better bin and capable of running at lower V-core than the 5900X, at least in our testing, and therefore runs it more efficiently than the others, so that explains why you see the numbers you do. In a single-threaded workload, the 12700K consumed about 32 watts during Cinebench one-tile or one-thread rendering. That's with VRM efficiency losses as always, and doesn't include the rest of the system. This is by design so that we can isolate the CPU. The 12700K ends up about the same as the 10900K for one-thread power consumption, and is technically lower in power consumption than the 5900X and 5950X, but not by so much that it makes much difference. It is a technical victory, though, for what that's worth. As we've discussed for the 12900K and 12600K reviews, we are actively working on new metrics and benchmarks for efficiency calculations, meaning that we're coupling power consumption and performance, as right now we have decoupled them for a sterilized analysis. Coupling them will give us another angle though, but that'll be a separate piece. Frequency validation will help us determine the differences between the 12900K and 12700K beyond the obvious. In an all-core workload with Blender, we monitored frequency for about 25 minutes, and we scaled the chart into these findings. The 12700K P-core average fluctuated, but was typically in the range of 4500 to 4600 megahertz. The 12700K's E-core performance, or the efficiency core, sat closer to 3600 megahertz, with occasional dips to 35. For the 12900K, frequency sat at 4900 megahertz flat. This will contribute to performance differences favoring the 12900K, even if the core count is underutilized on it. The 12900K E-core results was also higher at 3700 megahertz. Single-threaded behavior had the maximum frequency per interval at 5 GHz, with the E-cores at 3.8 GHz. The 12900K was closer to 5.2 on the P-cores instead, and again, that will contribute to some of the performance differences we'll see later. Blender cycles rendering on the CPU will be up first for our production benchmarks. In this one, the Intel i7-12700K finished the render in about 12 minutes, which marks it as roughly equivalent to the R9 5900X, a $500-ish CPU at its launch, while we purchased the 12700K for about $450. That's to say nothing, of course, of the cheaper KF, but then again, it's also to say nothing of the DDR5 memory prices and availability, although you could run this with D4. Worst case, the two are at near parity in performance, while AMD remains the efficiency king. The 12900K propels itself to 9.4 minutes, partly thanks to the extra 4 cores. They're still cores after all, just a bit slower, but it does so at the cost of a 54% increase in power consumption and a variable increase in price, maybe about 22 to 44% depending on the retailer. And that's compared to the 12700K, of course. The 12900K is therefore 18% faster to render, but 54% more power hungry than the 127. The 126, meanwhile, allows the 127 a lead of 22%. AMD is winning in efficiency, but Intel is a fierce competitor here, and it's especially strong as a price competitor. Price is where AMD has competed with Intel for years, so the favor is now being returned in full. This is promising and is one of the most exciting CPU cycles since the 8700K versus the 2700X, so we're happy to see the competition. In code compile with Chromium on Windows, the 12700K required 57 minutes to complete the work, requiring about 3% less time than the R9 5900X. The 12900K finished 14% faster than the 127K, so it is better, but the value of that improvement will be contingent on its price. We're not sure where the 129 has been selling right now. Launch day seems to indicate a range of $550 to $650, but we didn't get to see them in stock long enough to really take notice of it. So either way, it's 22 to 44% more expensive for 14% faster compile time and 54% more power consumption. AMD then remains competitive, but Intel is pulling ahead in raw performance, or minimally, again, is at parity for price comparative CPUs. The 12700K is far more efficient than the 12900K and is within 20% of the power of the 5900X. AMD should be worried, but it's not at a total loss yet. This is good to see because it'll push both companies forward. Adobe Premiere is what interests us the most. as we're considering pulling one of these CPUs for an upcoming production PC build for Andrew. In aggregate, the 12700K scored 959 points for filters, render, live playback, encoding, and effects. That ranks it as behind the 5950X, which leads by just 1.6%, while costing $300 more in retail than the raw CPU price. This is extremely competitive for Intel, which also benefits from quick sync on the non-F SKU of the 12700K. And to be clear for the YouTube demonetization gods, that's F SKU, not something else. The 12900K led the 12700K by 8%, hardly worth it for the power or the price. The 12600K also came close to the 12700K, which only held an advantage again of 7%. The 5800X gets dropped here down to 849 points, or a 13% lead for the 12700K. The 5800X recently got a price drop though at some retailers, so if that persists and it's wider spread than just Micro Center, it'll be worthy once again of consideration. Adobe Photoshop had the 12700K at 1210 points in aggregate, with the 12900K leading by 11%. The 5950X falls behind the much cheaper 12700K, as does the 5900X. The 12600K is close by also, again only led by 7% via the 12700K. One has to wonder why Intel thought launching the 11900K would be worth the reputational damage when looking at these results though. It's the perfect example of sunk cost fallacy. Compression testing looks comparatively better for AMD, at least with decompression. In compression though, the 12700K executed 111,000 MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, versus the 5900X's 12% higher 124K MIPS. The 12900K ranks similarly ahead, with the 5950X holding a more meaningful lead here than before. The 12700K ends up comparable to the 3900X, or ahead of the 5800X by about 19%. Decompression shuffles the stack considerably. The 12700K now falls below the 5800X, despite leading in compression previously, although the lead in compression is greater than the loss in decompression is. The 12900K is now 21% ahead of the 12700K, with the 5900X a staggering 48% ahead of the 12700K. AMD is particularly strong in decompression. Gaming benchmarks are up now. Hitman 3 is more memory sensitive than some of our other benchmarks, making for a particularly interesting comparison for the CPUs. The 12700K ran at 193 FPS average, leading the 12600K by 4% and being led by the 12900 by 5%. Compared to AMD, that means the 12700K holds an 8% lead over the 5900X in average FPS, or 14% lead over the 5800X. For lows, the 12700K maintains proportional frame time pacing as reflected in 1% and 0.1% values. There's nothing too exciting to look at here. The low gaps between the AMD CPUs don't exit what we'd expect, and neither part has a noteworthy advantage in that camp. In CSGO at 1080p, which is entirely CPU bound, as we'll show in our 1440p tests, the 12700K ran at 332 FPS average, outranking the 10900K from last generation and pulling ahead of the 12600K by 14%. That means the 5600X through the 5950X all enjoy a lead over the 12700K, unique to this benchmark, at least the way we conduct it. AMD does well here. The 12900K has been retested a few times and always lands in the same spot. At least it does with Windows 10, not 11, as we showed before. This has it about 11% ahead of the 12700K in Windows 10 for reference, and so AMD is a strong competitor in this one. But Intel is finally beginning to claw back its gaming performance after a tough previous generation. 1440p really just reaffirms previous positioning. It shows us that we're not even GPU bound at 1440p, and therefore certainly not at 1080p. The scaling on the results stack is the same in this set of data as a result. Red Dead 2 is sort of the antithesis of the previous benchmark, as it becomes more bound up in the GPU with our test settings. This means that it isn't a pure CPU benchmark, but it's still useful as a representation of what happens and how scaling changes as other binds are introduced. This is more realistic, perhaps, but it's also less useful for determining the maximum delta between CPUs. It is therefore imperfect, and not how we'd prefer to run the testing, but for now, until we modify the test setup, this is what it'll be. The 12700K and the 12900K are about the same here, as are the 11700K and the 10900K entries. The 5950X and 5900X do fall behind, but not by as much as in some of the other tests due to the GPU constraint. The 12600K more notably falls off, as does the 5600X, where the 12700K holds about a 10% lead for each, plus or minus a little bit. The dip in 0.1% lows for the 12900K is due to bouncing off of the GPU limiter. We see this in some games, but more specifically, we've seen it in rage games. or the Rockstar game engine games. That's because the GPU limit screws with some of the frame time pacing a bit, at least in this title, and it's an observable effect we've seen elsewhere. As we showed in our Windows 11 versus 10 testing on Alder Lake, the biggest uplift from the OS change was actually not really in raw performance, it was in getting Alder Lake functional in some applications. Total War was the only game we've tested so far that was buggy enough to not even launch on Windows 10 with Alder Lake, but our understanding is that Microsoft and Intel are addressing DRM-specific issues causing similar behavior. Regardless, until we can run the 12700K on Windows 11, we don't have data for it in Three Kingdoms, as it was still unable to get past the game's menu with Windows 10. This will likely be fixed, but general compatibility remains the best reason so far for running Windows 11 on the 12th gen CPUs. Far Cry 6 is brand new to our test suite. In this one, the 12700K ran at 143 FPS average, but had problematic lows. Retesting on the 12900K did eventually produce better results, but we've been unable to yield the same uplift on the 12700K or 12600K, proportional to the average, with additional test passes. As a note, we do a minimum of 4 test passes, but some of these CPUs have received up to 12 for validation. We'll look at frame time plotting momentarily to better understand why these dips are emerging. In average FPS alone, the 12700K and 5900X are about equal, with the 5800X not far behind, about 4.4% ahead of the 12700K. The lows favor AMD and older Intel here, however, so that's something we need to look at. Here's a frame time plot to better understand the situation. Here, the Intel 12700K mostly runs extremely low frame times at around 6 to 8 milliseconds, which is why we saw such a high average FPS. Occasionally, we encounter spikes to 10, 27, or 30 milliseconds, and so on. These spikes are what average into the reduced 0.1% low number. That number is just an indicator for us, really, to trigger a deeper dive or investigation into the frame-to-frame metrics for a given test, which is what we see here. We aren't seeing any massive spikes that would be jarring stutters of, say, 1/10 of a second, but these spikes are still noticeable as slight juddering during gameplay. The 5800X provides perspective as to what the line should look like. It's more consistent, it's flatter, and it has fewer excursions from the mean, which is what we want to see. In Cyberpunk 2077, now updated to the latest version before Alder Lake's launch, we measured the 12700K just below the 10.9 and the 12900K. We're GPU bound here, finally, thanks to CDPR updating the game to a better code base. The differences on this chart are basically irrelevant once you get above the 5600X. We need more CPU bound scenarios, which we've presented earlier, to see true scaling. Still, this is at least useful for showing what you can expect when bound somewhere else for where the fall-off point is. Finally, in F1 2021, the Intel 12700K held 326 FPS average in our testing conditions when stock, bumping off the same limit as the 12900K. As F1 21 is an update to our test suite, we still need to investigate whether this is a memory or a GPU bind that we're seeing. For now, we're assuming it's a GPU bind. As a result of this, there's again not much difference in this result stack like Cyberpunk. We'd refer you instead to our CSGO and some of the other earlier results to get more valuable data for raw scaling. Remember this also, this is a brand new test bench suite for us with all new data, and we made it while moving. So we'll be tweaking it over the coming month or two and removing or modifying games to establish more useful differences. So at the end of all of this then, the 12700K continues the trend of Alder Lake thus far, which is that it's far more competitive really than anything Intel's launched recently. We said this in the last review too, where we're not sure if Intel was trying to prime us for this review by launching incredibly, impressively boring things for the last generation, especially 11 series, but generations before that as well, or if it was an accident and it just worked out that way. In either case, Alder Lake's actually very interesting. The 12 series is very interesting. And now finally, Intel's PR people will have videos from us that they can distribute internally and say, look, Steve doesn't hate everything we make. He does, in fact, like things when they're good and they make sense. So this falls in that camp where the 12600K, the 12900K, we could find arguments for them. The 12.6 is easier to argue for than the 12.9. 12.9 is a good performer, but it's a flagship product. It costs a flagship product's price. And you get fall off for, as always, it's a non-linear increase in the uplift in performance versus the increase in perceived value of your computer if you care about the specs listing on a forum in your signature. But the 12700K, typically these CPUs like the 5800X, the 3700X, the 11700K, the 10700K, these CPUs we don't normally care for out the gate. Typically what happens is over time as their prices fall about $50 to $100, we warm up to them and we say, okay, now the 10700K makes sense because it's cheaper than it was at launch, and the 11700K is kind of dumb. So that's where we start to open up to it, whereas initially we'll say, this is just like a weird stopgap filler, pointless product. The same goes for the 5800X, where at launch we were uninterested in it because the 5900X made far more sense for someone who was more core intensive, and the 5600X, you save money, you could put it towards the GPU or something. It was a different time back then for something that's more gaming focused. But over time, those CPUs make sense. The 5800X we saw recently drop to $300 or something a Micro Center or something like that. And I don't really live near a Micro Center. We don't consider them in our sort of retailer scope of pricing normally. But if you can get a 5800X for $300, it's far more interesting than it is at whatever it was before that, the 400s. And the 12700K forces sort of a price reduction on those parts, because if you can get the 12700K at the prices we did, $430, if you don't care about the IGP for the KF, that's like a competitive price. Intel's competing on price, which is not something Intel typically does. Intel and NVIDIA both have a tremendous amount of hubris, and it bleeds through into their pricing, where neither company historically has wanted to reduce its pricing to compete with AMD on price, because both want to maintain this, to project this image of a certain level of quality. And it's worked to some extent, but Intel has lost that ability as it's lost confidence in the products. So anyway, now they're competing on price. 12700K, we can see an argument for it for sure. We are going to put probably the K SKU after we're done with the IGP testing. The K SKU we bought, we're probably going to put in a production machine and see how we feel about it in sort of a long-term video editing, Photoshop, Unreal Engine heavy environment. Andrew will be using it. And see how it feels in real life. Now, for the most part, benchmarks represent real life usage. But sometimes we found, like with the 3175X, it doesn't quite behave the same way once you put it to use. So we will be doing that with the 12700K. We intend to do IGP benchmarks as well. If you're wondering, should I buy the K or the KF model, the argument we would make for one over the other would simply be, if you think there's value in having an IGP for troubleshooting, like if you don't get display out and you want to troubleshoot, is it my video card or is it something else? It's helpful to have the IGP, even if perhaps you won't use it beyond that, and to which extent you could maybe argue also that it's wasteful, or you won't get enough use to justify the cost bump. And you're kind of gambling on it, in a sense, breaking and needing it anyway. The IGP is also useful for quick sync, for lower power consumption tasks, if you don't want to spin up the GPU for it, assuming you're working in some kind of application that's intelligent enough to make this decision actively, and several of them are, then that's where we would argue for the IGP. But you do save a little bit of money by going for the F version, and that extra $20 may be more useful if you're on a really tight budget and you're trying to get the maximum you can out of it, in which case extra $20 maybe helps offset some of the motherboard or the memory cost or something like that. So we are not going to tell you which one to choose if you're choosing between them, because it's up to your use case, and that gives you enough information to make an informed decision. Do I really care about having troubleshooting abilities and quick sync? If you do video editing, you might care about quick sync, and certain other types of applications out there care as well. But if you're just gaming, maybe go for the F variant instead if you're buying a dedicated GPU. Versus AMD, the 5800X, we would need to see a more permanent or widespread price reduction in order to consider it. Price for price, the 12700 makes more sense. In decompression, AMD has a significant technology advantage in some of the benchmarks, but for the most part, Intel is pulling ahead here. AMD remains the efficiency king right now, where Intel is reminding us of AMD in the past. It's competing on price, and it's a little bit power hungry in its effort to try and compete. The 12900K is incredibly power hungry. It's great for heating a room. But there's more to that story too, and we're gonna look at that in a separate video. So subscribe for that. Hopefully this gives you a good enough set of data to work from to see if you want the 12700K. And as always, subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for bonus videos and write-ups. You can also go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to grab one of our mod mats, our toolkits, which are on back order now, or one of our wireframe desk-sized mouse mats for your keyboard and mouse. Thank you for watching as always. We'll see you all next time.